Earlier we went through a list of what Sanders refers to as a list of secure facts about the life and death of Jesus and the aftermath of Jesus' life. As I said, these are historical facts that the majority of today's historians are agreed actually happened before and after Jesus' death. Let me repeat the last couple of bullet points on that list. Okay, about the year 30 or 33 AD, he went to Jerusalem for Passover. He created a disturbance in the temple area. He had a final meal with the disciples. He was arrested and interrogated by Jewish authorities, specifically the high priest, and he was executed on the orders of the Roman prefect Pontius Pilate. As I said, Sanders then goes on to provide what he refers to as a short list of equally secure facts about the aftermath of Jesus' life. These are: the disciples first fled. The disciples saw Jesus, but in what sense is not certain, after his death. As a consequence, they believed he would return to found the kingdom. And they formed a community to await his return and sought to win others to faith in him as God's Messiah. Now, I guess the purpose of the remainder of this evening is really to focus on that third last bullet point. Today's historians, both Christian and non-Christian, are agreed that something happened to convince the disciples they had seen Jesus after his death. So, what did the disciples see and experience? Now, in the rational 21st century, it's difficult to get our heads around the idea of a man dying and coming back to life again 3 days later. Our medical knowledge, our knowledge of biology and physics, our own personal experience all tell us that people just don't come back to life again after they die. So we might think, sure, there's some other explanation. Well, what we'll do now is look at some of the more common alternative explanations and see how they sit with the evidence we have for what happened. Okay, so one explanation could be it's pretty easy to appear to your disciples after your death if you didn't die in the first place. So, was Jesus really executed? Could he have been taken down off the cross before he died, then revived later? Now, at first glance, that doesn't look too implausible. We've all heard of people who've been pronounced dead, then to everyone's surprise, revived some hours or days later in a mortuary or hospital. Well, this fella up on the screen here, that's a chap called Walter Williams. He died, in inverted commas, in Alabama in 2014. He was in the mortuary on that gurney with that body bag over the top of him, and the mortician heard a scratching underneath the body bag. The mortician unzipped it, and there's Walter Williams recovering in hospital. Now, if this kind of thing can happen occasionally today, what about 2,000 years ago when medical knowledge was more primitive? Could the Romans have made a mistake? Alternatively, was the whole thing faked? Was the crucifixion somehow staged, managed as some form of diversion to allow Jesus to escape? Well, in response, consider the following. Historians and archaeologists can tell us quite a lot about Roman torture and execution techniques. I'm not going to go into the gory details here. There are plenty of internet sites, books and TV programs about that very subject if you're interested. Now, what our knowledge of Roman torture and execution tells us is that it was very, very unlikely that anyone survived a Roman crucifixion. Now, we know of one or two other examples from other sources that it did happen, but it was a very rare occurrence. Even if Jesus could have been taken down before he died and the nails taken out of his wrists and feet, he would have been unable to use his hands, and he wouldn't have been able to walk. It's very unlikely he would have ever made a full recovery. Also, he wasn't executed by amateurs. Roman soldiers did the job. Now, they might not have had 21st century medical knowledge. They knew exactly how to kill somebody. That's what they were trained to do. They were professional career killers. Also, he was executed in the orders of the Roman prefect Pontius Pilate, One argument goes that perhaps the soldiers had been bribed by persons unknown not to kill Jesus. Instead, they were to stage manage a fake execution. Firstly, that would have been kind of difficult, as it was a public crucifixion, as all crucifixions were. That was the whole point, to act as a warning to others not to disturb the Roman order. Secondly, if that had been found out, the soldiers would have disobeyed a direct command from the Roman ruler of Judea. A slow and painful death would have been the inevitable result. Also, the sources tell us that Jesus was tortured and flogged before he was crucified. So in short, just suppose he was able to survive the crucifixion. Just suppose there was some plot to get him off the cross. What kind of condition would he have been in? Hardly an impressive sight for the disciples a few days later. Hardly an inspiration for the disciples then to go and spread the message of a risen Christ, triumphing over death throughout the Eastern Roman Empire. So, in summary, it's highly unlikely that Jesus survived the crucifixion. It's also highly unlikely the whole thing was stage managed either. However, as I'm sure you're aware, the fake crucifixion theory has had some popular currency in the last few years. If you've read the book or seen the film of Dan Brown's Da Vinci Code, you'll know that one theory is that Jesus didn't die on the cross. Instead, he escapes to southern France along with his wife, Mary Magdalene. In southern France, their children intermarry with the Merovingians, thus creating a holy bloodline the Catholic Church has been trying to suppress ever since. That theory is based on an earlier book called by three people called Bajan, Lee and Lincoln, called The Holy Blood and the Holy Grail. It is up in the top right-hand corner there. Now, we could spend some time this evening looking at the pros and cons of this theory. However, that would be going over ground well covered in the numerous books and articles written on the subject currently available. Instead, I think I can say that this theory is just that, a theory. Now, whilst there are factual elements, historically factual elements to this theory, other facts are ignored. There's also a large amount of speculation required to arrive at the conclusions the books and film make. If this is an area of interest to you, my suggestion would be to read the reviews of the books and reviews of the articles on the subject. A simple Google search will get you going. And I think a review of these items will, I think you'll find, demonstrate why this theory really has no serious takers amongst the overwhelming majority of today's historians. Okay. So it would look most likely that Jesus was executed. Well, what happened to his dead body? Now, this is important to consider. Clearly, it would have been difficult to explain Jesus being alive after his death if his corpse was still in the tomb. The Gospel account is Jesus was executed, he was prepared for burial, and placed in a rock-caved tomb. On the third day after his death, some of his female followers went to the tomb, and they found the tomb empty and Jesus' body missing. As I mentioned earlier, although the documentary of evidence in the Gospels seems to vary in some of the details of the empty tomb, this event is present in all four Gospels. Clearly, early Christians believed that his body had disappeared from earth so they could come back alive again to his followers. Okay. Are there any other explanations why his body might have been missing? Well, perhaps the best way of looking at this is to look for a motive. Who could have removed the body from the tomb, and what would their motive be for doing so? Well, I guess the Romans could have, and the Romans' main concern was maintaining order in Jerusalem. Their motivation for executing Jesus, as we've seen from E.P. Sanders' list, was in direct response to the disturbance Jesus had created in the temple area. This disturbance created the unrest the Romans were always seeking to avoid in this very volatile part of their empire. Now, Jesus had some very devoted followers. Perhaps the Romans were concerned that by leaving Jesus' body in the tomb, it would become a shrine to Jesus and a focal point for further unrest. Now, This line of thought does have some modern parallels. For example, at the end of the Second World War, the Russian army discovered Hitler's dead body in the burned out bunker in Berlin. However, they destroyed the body completely so that it could not be buried. Their concern was that Hitler's grave would become a focal point for Nazi sympathisers in the future. However, what undermines that theory is that very shortly after Jesus' death, his followers are going around saying that he's risen from the dead. They're making a nuisance of themselves and causing the very disorder the Romans were trying to avoid. Indeed, the Romans then spent the next 300 odd years trying to suppress the disorder that had developed through the empire as a result of this one event. So, to nip it all in the bud, to stop it all getting out of hand, if the Romans had taken Jesus' body, well, would they not have produced it? Well, you remember from the first half, a common fate for crucifixion victims was that they were thrown in the municipal rubbish dump and were where they were eaten by wild animals and dogs. If that is what the Romans had done with Jesus' body, they might not have had it to produce. However, it had been a relatively simple thing to publicly state this is what had happened to the body. However, we've got no direct evidence or even hints of evidence that anything like that actually happened. I think we have to conclude it's unlikely the Romans were responsible for the empty tomb. Well, what about the Jewish authorities? Well, their motive for taking the body and the counter-arguments are pretty much the same as the Romans. Well, what about the disciples? Would they have a motive for taking Jesus' body? Well, this would also look to be unlikely. I personally can't think of a motive they might have for doing that. Also, the disciples believed that Jesus was raised from the dead and were prepared to die for that belief. In most cases, they did die for that belief. If they had taken the body, why then would they make up the raised from the dead story? Be prepared to die in defence of it? It just doesn't make any sense. What about grave robbers? Now, to me, the idea that grave robbers stole Jesus' body looks like more of a possibility. Grave robbing did occur at that time. Grave robbers were usually looking for the valuable goods, sometimes buried with a body. In fewer cases, they were looking for the body itself or body parts for use in magic rituals. Well, was there anything to steal? The Synoptic Gospels, that's the Gospels of Matthew, Mark and Luke, mention that Jesus' body was wrapped in a linen cloth. No grave goods are mentioned. Grave robbers usually steal the goods buried with a body, not the decomposing body itself. Now, John's Gospel mentions about 34 kilograms of myrrh and aloes were wrapped tightly in the linen cloth around Jesus' body. Now, that would have been worth stealing. However, John's Gospel also tells us that Jesus' grave clothes were in the tomb, with the burial cloth neatly folded, when the disciples entered the tomb and found Jesus' body missing. That doesn't fit with the grave robbing theory. If you're robbing a grave of spices wrapped tightly into the linen binding around a dead body, it would make sense to take the body somewhere else, unwrap the body, take the spices, or unwrap the body in the tomb and take the spices. In the first scenario, there would have been no body or grave clothes in the tomb. In the second scenario, there would have been a dead body and the grave clothes in the tomb. Neither situation is described in John's Gospel. So, we know from a few Roman and Greek sources that dead human bodies or body parts were used in magic rituals around the Roman Empire. However, the practice wasn't rife, and we have no evidence that this occurred within the Jewish part of the Roman Empire. Indeed, Jews would find this kind of behaviour abhorrent. This burial occurred in Jerusalem, the most Jewish of Jewish towns and cities. That makes the concept of a stolen body for the purposes of magic even less likely than if the burial had occurred in, say, Alexandria or Rome or Athens or somewhere like that. So, nobody seems to have a particularly strong motive for either taking the body or keeping it a secret if they had done so. One final point I think is worth making in this subject: the disciples of Jesus are the founders of what we know as Christianity. After the resurrection, they didn't go to some obscure place miles away from where it all happened to preach about the resurrection. No, they came back to Jerusalem, the very place of Jesus' execution and tomb. Fundamental to their preaching was the empty tomb of Jesus. If that preaching had been false, it would have been clearly evident to the people of Jerusalem. Some people would be bound to know where Jesus' tomb was and or what happened to the body. Indeed, he was buried in the tomb of a prominent member of the Sanhedrin, that is the Jewish ruling council, Joseph of Arimathea. Somebody would have been bound to know where Joseph of Arimathea's tomb was. Or Joseph of Arimathea knew where his tomb was, obviously, because he wasn't dead. So in conclusion, I suppose we can't say there is any concrete evidence to demonstrate that Jesus' body left earth as the disciples claimed. However, what is clearer is that his body has disappeared, and that those with a vested interest in claiming it was still on earth, that is the Romans, the temple authorities, couldn't prove that it actually was. Okay. Was Jesus seen alive by his followers after his death? As at the start of this half of the evening, I mentioned E.P. Sanders' secure fact that Jesus' disciples saw him, but in what sense is not certain, after his death. We saw this, as we saw, Sanders says this because historians are of the majority view that Jesus' disciples saw him after his death. I guess what historians are less certain about is the "in what sense" part of that statement. So what do the Gospels and letters of Paul say? Well, there's more than one appearance. In the Bible, there are 11 separate and distinct appearance events described. These happen to individuals, groups of people, and in one case, over 500 people. They happen over a period of 40 days after Jesus' death, with the exception of his appearance to Paul, which happened much later. The Gospels are clear that Jesus was with them physically. He could eat, drink, cook, be touched, and be conversed with. But he could also appear and disappear at will. Often in the appearance events, the disciples don't seem to immediately recognise the person they're with as Jesus. Now, as I said earlier, in the rational 21st century, it's difficult to get our heads around the idea of a man dying, coming back to life again 3 days later. Our medical knowledge, our understanding of biology and physics, our own personal experience all tell us that people just don't come back to life after they die. So, are there any other possible explanations for what the disciples saw other than the risen Christ? Well, did they see a ghost? Now, for us in the rational 21st century, it's probably about as hard to grasp as seeing the resurrected Jesus. However, the descriptions of a physical Jesus that could eat, drink, and be touched doesn't sound like a spectral appearance. Well, were they subject to some form of hysteria? Now, the followers of Jesus would have been very distraught after his death. That can make people a bit irrational and unstable. Is it possible that seeing Jesus alive again was all in their mind? Some sort of mass hallucination, fevered imagination, or wish fulfillment? Now, in response to that, our knowledge of psychology tells us that hallucinations are individual occurrences. They aren't something that happen to groups of people at the same time. And I could be up here having all kinds of hallucinations, but you're not getting any of them because I can't transmit them to you by my brain waves. It's just physically impossible. So this is important to consider because people talk about mass hallucination as if it's a thing. It's only a thing in a sentence if you have the word mass and you stick the word hallucination next to it to get the phrase mass hallucination. It can exist in a sentence. It can't exist in real life. Now, having just said that, you could just about imagine a situation where a small group of people grieving in a room together might work themselves up into such an emotional frenzy that they were able to convince each other that they saw the person they were grieving over. Could any of the appearance events fit with something like that? Well, if I'm honest, the circumstances of one or two could. Although, if I'm also honest, there's nothing in the sources hinting that anything like that actually happened. For the rest, the actual appearance events in the Gospels just don't fit with some form of hysterical event. For example, two disciples are walking to a village called Emmaus in broad daylight. They're chatting when suddenly Jesus appears with them. In another example, the disciples are out catching fish in the Sea of Galilee. As they come ashore, Jesus is waiting for them and has cooked breakfast for them. In another one, Jesus appears to more than 500 people at the same time. As I mentioned a few minutes ago, there are 11 separate appearance events in the documentary evidence we've got. When these are studied and dissected, there's little or no evidence to suggest that hysteria played a part in the appearance events experienced by the disciples. Okay, another explanation could be, well, they just make it all up. As I mentioned before, nearly all the disciples met violent deaths. What did I go? Oh, I didn't do that. Sorry. Yeah, right, there we are. Caught up. As I mentioned before, nearly all the disciples met violent deaths proclaiming Jesus as the risen Son of God. They just wouldn't have done that if they'd made the whole thing up. So, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, today's historians, Christian and non-Christian, specialising in first century Near Eastern history, are of the majority view that the disciples saw Jesus after his death. So, in what sense did they see Jesus? Well, it's unlikely they saw a ghost. It's unlikely they suffered some form of hysterical event. It's unlikely they made it all up. Now, as I've said a few times, in the rational 21st century, it's difficult to get our heads around the idea of a man dying and coming back to life again 3 days later. It's pretty implausible. It just doesn't happen. But historians tell us that the disciples saw Jesus after his death. We've looked at various explanations for this. By deduction, it would seem that the least unlikely explanation is they actually saw Jesus alive after his death. By deduction, the other explanations look even more implausible than that. Excuse me. Okay. So, analysis of the evidence we've looked at so far this evening points to the resurrection being an actual historical event. However, is there any other evidence we should consider? Well, I think the answer to that is yes. We're just going to cover a few of them just now. Now, we've touched on this a few minutes ago. Let's consider this in a bit more detail. Well, so what, you might say? You might say countless people have died for their beliefs since the disciples. For thousands of years, people have been enthusiastically dying for what they sincerely believe in. From the suffragette Emily Davison to the IRA hunger striker Bobby Sands, to the suicide bombers of Iraq, Israel and Afghanistan, to the terrorists involved in the London tube bombing, to the Jews of the Spanish Inquisition. These are just a few of the countless numbers of people who have died for their sincerely held beliefs since the disciples. However, there's one key difference with the disciples. The disciples sincerely believed that Jesus had died, and they had personally met him after his death. They sincerely believed that he had personally conversed with him, eaten with him, and touched him, and were prepared to die for that belief. What they weren't prepared to die for was a set of an ideology or set of beliefs passed on to them from some political or religious leader. Now, you could say later Christian martyrs could fit into that category, probably unfairly, but you could say it. However, with Jesus' disciples, it's different. They were prepared to die and did die because they had personally seen Jesus alive after his death. That points clearly to the disciples having actually seen Jesus after his death. Okay, another piece of circumstantial evidence is, in the early days of Christianity, two of the early leaders of the Way, as the early Christians called themselves, were people who'd been unconvinced that Jesus was the Son of God. We heard earlier on this evening about Paul. When he was called Saul, he was a persecutor of Christians. What changed him to being a follower of Jesus was meeting Jesus alive on the road to Damascus sometime after his death. Now, the other former skeptic and early leader we know of is James, the brother of Jesus. Now, Jesus wasn't an only child. He had a number of brothers and sisters. His whole family, including his mother, initially tried to stop him in his mission. In Mark's Gospel, his whole family, presumably James included, come to get him. Mark says, when his family heard about this, that is his teaching, they went to take charge of him. For they said, he's out of his mind. That's Mark chapter 3, verse 20. Now, James isn't mentioned as a follower of Jesus in the Gospels. Yet in the early church, James was a leading figure. Well, why the change? We're told in Paul's letters that James too had seen Jesus alive after his death. James changed from being a skeptic to a believer after seeing the risen Christ. Okay, another piece of circumstantial evidence are some changes to key social structures, and I guess the best way of thinking about this is ask yourself the question, why are there Jews today? Jews can trace their origins back to the tribal Middle East of 3,000 to 4,000 years ago. There were other peoples around at that time. Why is it then that there are no people alive today who would call themselves Babylonians, Ammonites, Assyrians, Hittites, and so on? Well, the answer in part is in the social and religious structures that make Jews Jews. Jewish people have lived side by side with non-Jews for the last 2,000 years, but have remained distinctly different because of their own customs, laws, eating habits, religious practices, religious beliefs, and so on. To Jews, these are the things that make them who they are and are terribly important to them. Now, some have viewed the early Jewish Christians as just another Jewish sect. And in a sense, they were. However, they were different from those other Jewish sects that existed at that time. Those other sects didn't disagree on the fundamentals of Judaism. Now, the first Christians were all Jews. We've got clear evidence that early after Jesus' death, these Jewish Christians rejected many of the foundations of Judaism. Now, that was an enormous social leap, and one that brought with it great personal risk to their lives. We've also got evidence that these changes weren't made lightly or easily by the early Jewish Christians. So what were these changes? Well, they stopped offering animal sacrifice. They eventually rejected the belief that keeping Moses' laws, not the Ten Commandments, but the other eating, social and sacrifice laws that Jews believed was the way to be right with God. They changed their Sabbath from Saturday to Sunday. They believed in a Trinity, that is one God in three forms. This is blasphemy to the Jews. They believed the Messiah had come. Jews were and are still waiting. And they initiated the new ritual of the Lord's Supper, a ritual that celebrates Jesus' victory over death. Why did the early Jewish Christians make these changes? Because their leaders had seen Jesus alive after his death. Remembered his teachings and were therefore compelled to make these changes. Okay, another piece of circumstantial evidence is, earlier on we talked about how quickly after Jesus' death Christianity caught hold and spread through the Roman world. Well, why did that happen? Equally importantly, why did Christianity survive? Particularly when other religious fads we're aware of that existed in the Roman world didn't survive. Why didn't Christianity fizzle out after a few decades? Well, the answer is the resurrection. A core of people witnessed Jesus alive after his death. The sources tell us this cohort of people were transformed from illiterate fishermen, Jewish zealots, tax collectors and other ordinary people into tireless advocates for the risen Jesus. As we saw earlier on from E.P. Sanders' books, the disciples formed a community to wait his return and sought to win others to faith in him as God's Messiah. They did all that because of the resurrection. Frankly, without the resurrection, there would be no lasting Christianity. Frankly, without the resurrection, we wouldn't be here tonight. So, I started this presentation by making two statements. There's a historical and rational basis for Jesus being the Son of God. And there's a wealth of evidence to support that view. Let's briefly run through what we've covered this evening. So, we stated that the Gospels and most of the letters of Paul are likely to provide an accurate account of Jesus' life, death and resurrection. We stated that the view of today's historians is that these documents have been, on the whole, accurately preserved for us and haven't been subject to accidental or deliberate modification. We reviewed other information that was contemporary to but out with the Gospels. That provided information that didn't contradict what was in the Gospels and letters of Paul. We presented evidence demonstrating it was very likely that Jesus saw himself as the Son of God. We suggested it was very unlikely that he saw himself that way due to some psychological condition. And we also suggested that when the sources are reviewed, there's no evidence to suggest that Jesus either deliberately or unintentionally misled his followers. We presented evidence demonstrating that it was very likely that Jesus was executed and died. We presented evidence demonstrating that it was very likely he was buried and that shortly afterwards his tomb was found to be empty. We looked at possible reasons for his tomb being empty. And we suggested that the least unlikely explanation was that his body was no longer on earth. We looked at the historical basis for Jesus' appearance to his disciples. We found that this is regarded as a secure fact by most historians. And we reviewed what it was the disciples saw. We suggested that the least unlikely explanation was that the disciples saw, met, talked with, and ate with Jesus in bodily form after his death. Lastly, we looked at circumstantial evidence for the resurrection, and we suggested that without the resurrection, it's likely that the disciples would not have died for their beliefs. Skeptics like Paul and James would not have been converted. A clear separation of Jewish Christians and Judaism would not have occurred. The early church would not have emerged and spread so quickly. Christianity would not have lasted to this day. Now, history is sometimes not an exact discipline. We sometimes have difficulty saying with absolute certainty that something happened in the past at a particular time and it happened in a particular way. Even today, with mass communication, controversy can rage relating to events that happened last week or a few years ago. For example, John F. Kennedy's assassination, Princess Diana's death, and Twin Towers, and so on and so forth. Now, it's the same with Jesus' life, death, and resurrection. I can't say with absolute certainty that the evidence I presented this evening is 100% correct. I can't say with absolute certainty, based on this, that Jesus is the Son of God. But what I think I can say is that Jesus being the Son of God is the most likely explanation of the pretty extensive evidence that we've got. What I can say is that looked at rationally, the alternative explanations for the evidence are just simply far less likely. Now, I'm sure some of you will be agreeing with this. I'm also sure some of you will be thinking, isn't this a bit one-sided? Christian presents evidence for Christianity in church setting. Sure, there's another point of view. Well, frankly, if I'd been sitting where you are when I was an agnostic, that's exactly what I'd be thinking. However, my spiritual journey didn't end by reading The Case for Christ and a few Christian histories on the life of Jesus. I trawled bookshop for books on atheism. I felt sure that I'd find some atheistic stuff that would blow all this out the water. I scoured the atheist websites. I read detailed hostile reviews of the case for Christ. I listened to and read books and articles by atheists. I still do. It's blooming depressing, but there you are. I read the New Testament for myself. I read biographies and critiques of Jesus by non-Christians. I'd also encourage anyone with doubts about the material presented to do exactly the same. And what was the result of all that research? Well, I think I can summarise that by saying I was an agnostic then, I'm a Christian now. Okay, what we haven't discussed this evening is Jesus' message and what it means. What we haven't discussed is why Jesus' message and a relationship with Jesus Christ is important to you today. You may or may not be glad to know I'm not going to start now. However, consider this. If Jesus is the Son of God, if Jesus is real, then his message is real too. In the last 2,000 years, countless lives have been positively transformed by Jesus' message and a relationship with Jesus Christ. If you truly accept Jesus' message, and I'm stressing the words, truly accept, and Jesus' message, it's always a positive transformation. So, in conclusion, do you not owe it to yourselves to weigh up the evidence and decide what you think? If you do that and decide that Jesus is real, do you not owe it to yourselves to find out what his message is and start to experience the positive transformation in your life that comes from a relationship with Jesus Christ? Thank you.